This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. Ripe tomatoes smell like summer refusing to leave. That was the first thing every Saturday morning at the Briar Station Farmers Market. The scent rising warm and green from the crates Caleb Mercer set along the fold-out table, mixing with grain dust and the iron sweetness of turned earth drifting in from the fields beyond the parking lot. October light, thin, gold, the kind that made every barn and fence post throw shadows twice their height across the gravel lot, where a dozen vendors arranged their tables in two crooked rows. Caleb's stand sat near the east end, between a honey seller and a woman who knitted hats that looked like various woodland animals. Gunner, perimeter. The German shepherd rose from beneath the table and began his circuit. 2 laps, always 2. Clockwise first, then counter, nose sampling the air at each corner of the market grounds, before returning to his spot beside the cooler. 6 years old, 85 pounds, with a black saddle coat that caught the early light, and a way of moving that still looked like patrol. Caleb watched him go while arranging peppers in a wooden crate. 45 years old, broad through the shoulders, hands scarred from decades of rope and metal and salt water. A horizontal line across his right palm, white and smooth, where a mooring line had ripped through his glove during a storm rescue off the Florida Keys 11 years ago. He wore a canvas work jacket, no insignia, jeans with dirt at the knees. Nothing about him said 22 years in the United States Coast Guard, except the way he stood. Weight balanced, scanning without turning his head, cataloging every vehicle that pulled into the lot. Gunner completed his second lap and returned. He circled once, then dropped into a sphinx position beside Caleb's boots, chin on paws. All clear? The dog's ears twitched. Acceptable. The morning moved the way Saturday mornings move in small farm towns. Slow, neighborly, punctuated by the slam of truck tailgates and the particular laughter of people who have known each other long enough to skip the pleasantries. Caleb sold tomatoes, banana peppers, 2 bags of late-season squash. A retired school teacher named Gladys bought a pint of cherry tomatoes and told him his plants were healthier than anything she'd seen in 40 years of gardening. He thanked her without saying much else. Then Ed Crowell backed his grain truck into the lot. The truck was a white Kenworth, dusted with chaff, pulling a hopper trailer loaded with harvested wheat from the fields south of town. Ed parked near the feed store entrance at the far end of the market and climbed down to talk with another farmer. Gunner lifted his head. Caleb noticed the movement, small, specific, not the casual alertness of a dog watching a squirrel. This was different. Gunner's ears rotated forward and locked. His nostrils flared in short, rhythmic pulls. Then his body lowered toward the ground, shoulders dropping, hindquarters shifting backward. He was backing away from the truck. Caleb set down the squash he was holding. He had seen this posture 100 times. Not here. Not in Iowa. On the deck of a Coast Guard cutter in the Caribbean, when Gunner's nose had found cocaine hidden inside engine housings. In a harbor warehouse on the Gulf Coast, when Gunner had detected chemical residue on shipping drums that later tested positive for industrial solvent. Ears flat forward, body low, retreating while staring. Chemical detection alert. "Gunner, here!" The dog came. He pressed against Caleb's leg, still facing the truck, muscles rigid beneath his coat. Caleb looked at the grain trailer. Wheat. Just wheat, as far as he could see. Chaff catching the wind. Ed Crowell laughing about something with his neighbor. "What are you smelling, buddy?" Gunner did not answer, but he did not relax either. His eyes stayed fixed on the trailer, and the short, rhythmic breathing through his nose continued, pulling scent, sorting it, finding something in the grain dust that did not belong. Caleb glanced at Ed, then back at the dog. 22 years in the Coast Guard Investigative Service had taught him one thing above all others. When the dog tells you something is wrong, the dog is not guessing. He walked to Ed's truck after the farmer finished his conversation. Kept it casual. "Morning, Ed. Good harvest?" "Can't complain." Ed wiped his forehead with a bandana. "Henderson fields came in heavy this year. You growing anything besides tomatoes over there?" "Trying to." "Where'd this load come from?" "Same as always. Henderson's south section, out past the county road." "Why?" "No reason. Dog was acting funny near your rig. Probably a field mouse in the chaff." Ed laughed. Caleb did not. He walked back to his stand. Gunner had not moved from his alert position. The dog's eyes tracked the grain truck until Ed drove it out of the lot 20 minutes later. And even after the truck disappeared past the grain elevator on Route 14, Gunner stood watching the empty road. Something in that grain was not grain. And whatever it was, Caleb's dog had spent 4 years in the Coast Guard learning to find it. Monday smelled like diesel and cold metal at the grain elevator on Route 14. Caleb heard about Tomas Reyes at the hardware store on Main Street, standing in the fastener aisle looking for lag bolts, when Dale Hammond, behind the counter, said it to another customer the way people in small towns deliver serious news, quietly, with a shake of the head, as if volume might make it more real. Fella collapsed right there at the elevator loading dock. Ambulance took him to Marion General. They're saying some kind of poisoning. Caleb set the lag bolts on the counter. Poisoning? Chemical, I heard. Farm worker. One of the seasonal crew out at Henderson's. The other customer, a heavy man in a Carhartt jacket, shook his head. "Third time in 2 years somebody's gotten sick working those fields. Nobody says anything because the crews are seasonal. They move on." "Third time?" "My cousin runs a cleaning service. She had a girl quit last spring. Said she got dizzy every time she drove past the Henderson place with the windows down." The man shrugged. "Could be nothing." "Could be something." Dale Hammond leaned on the counter. "You asking as a customer or as something else?" "Just a neighbor." "Uh-huh." Dale rang up the lag bolts. $6.42. Caleb paid. He did not go home. He drove east on the county road with Gunner in the passenger seat, windows cracked despite the October chill. The fields on both sides of the road stretched flat to the horizon. Corn stubble to the north, harvested wheat to the south, all of it gold and brown under a sky so wide it made the land look like a table. The Henderson farm entrance was marked by a metal gate and a mailbox shaped like a barn. Caleb slowed. His hands stayed on the wheel. The turn signal clicked, but he did not turn. He had come to Iowa to grow tomatoes, to stand in dirt that did not smell like evidence, to stop being the man who noticed things, collected things, filed things in triplicate while people around him got sick and died. The lag bolts in his passenger seat were for a shelf he was building in his kitchen. That was supposed to be the day. Shelf, bolts, Saturday market. Simple. The turn signal kept clicking. Gunnar shifted in the passenger seat, pressing his nose toward the window, toward the farm road. The dog's ears were forward. Caleb turned. He pulled his truck onto the access road and parked near the equipment shed. He was not law enforcement. He had no badge, no warrant, no authority. He was a neighbor checking on things after hearing bad news. That was all. But his hands remembered other things. He let Gunnar out and walked the field edge along the southern section. Soybeans in one plot, wheat stubble in the next. The irrigation system, center pivot, standard for this county, sat still, pipes stretching in a long aluminum arm across the field. Crows working the stubble scattered as Gunnar trotted past, black wings folding into the low gray sky. Caleb smelled it before he saw it, a sharpness beneath the turned earth smell, metallic and wrong, like battery acid mixed with something organic. His sinuses tightened. He breathed through his mouth and kept walking. Then he saw the circles. Around each irrigation sprinkler head, in a radius of roughly 6 feet, the ground was dead. Not dormant, dead. Grass, clover, volunteer wheat, dandelions. Everything within that circle had turned brown and brittle, crackling under his boot when he stepped on it. Beyond the circle, green. Inside the circle, ash-colored decay arranged in perfect geometric rings across the field. The precision was what stopped him. Nature did not kill in circles. Drought browned whole pastures. Fungus spread in irregular patches. Insects followed root systems. But these were compass-drawn arcs, each one centered on the exact point where chemical-treated water hit the soil and radiated outward until dilution overtook lethality. Caleb crouched at the edge of one circle. The soil inside was dry and chalky, a different color than the loam 6 inches beyond the line. He pressed 2 fingers into the dead zone. The earth crumbled like calcium powder. He lifted his fingers to his nose and pulled them away immediately. "Gunnar, such!" The shepherd moved forward, nose to the ground. He reached the edge of the dead circle and stopped. His whole body locked, ears flat, nostrils working, hindquarters shifting backward. He would not step inside. A low sound rose from his chest, not quite a growl, more like an engine idling in mourning. Same posture as Saturday, same chemical alert, but stronger now. The smell concentrated here at the source, not diluted through grain chaff in a parking lot. Caleb stood slowly. He counted the dead circles he could see from where he stood. 9, evenly spaced, each one centered precisely on a sprinkler head, where treated water had soaked the soil and killed everything it touched. In the distance, a 10th circle marked the far reach of the pivot arm, barely visible against the tree line. "All right," he said to no one. Gunnar stood beside him at the field edge, still refusing to enter the dead zone. The wind moved through the standing corn in the next plot, a dry, rustling sound, and somewhere a meadowlark called from a fence post. The October light fell flat across the field, throwing no shadows, making the dead circles look like burn marks on a kitchen table. 6-foot circles of dead earth, perfect as compass arcs. Whatever was coming through those sprinklers was killing everything it touched. And Tomas Reyes had been standing in it, breathing it, absorbing it through his skin, until his body had decided it had absorbed enough. Caleb kept a box of nitrile gloves in the glove compartment of his truck. He had kept them there for 2 years since moving to Iowa, like jumper cables or a flashlight. Items you hoped never to need, but could not bring yourself to throw away. He pulled on the gloves. The snap of latex against his wrist was a sound from another life. At the back of the truck, he found a roll of plastic bags, a marker, and a small notebook. He labeled 3 bags. Henderson South, Circle 1. Henderson South, Circle 2. Henderson South, Field Edge Control. He knelt at the first dead circle and pressed a gloved hand into the chalky soil. It crumbled easily, powdery and pale. He scooped a fistful into the first bag and sealed it. Gunnar watched from the truck bed, chin resting on the tailgate rail. His ears tracked Caleb's movement across the field, left and right, steady as a compass needle. "Yeah, I know. You already told me." He collected the second sample from a circle near the equipment shed, then a control sample from untreated soil 20 yards beyond the pivot arm's reach. 3 bags, labeled with location, date, depth, and the initials CM. Sealed with the fold and press method he had been taught at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, during his first year as a CGIS Special Agent trainee. His handwriting on the bags was small and precise. Muscle memory. The body remembered procedures the mind tried to forget. He stood in the field, holding 3 sealed bags of Iowa dirt, and felt the pull of a life he had walked away from. 2 years ago, he had driven from the Gulf Coast to the center of the country with a dog and a truck and a plan to never collect another sample, never write another evidence log, never stand in a courtroom watching a judge decide whether his work counted. He had traded investigation for irrigation, chain of custody for crop rotation, and for 2 years it had worked. The smell of the soil stayed on his gloves even after he peeled them off. That metallic sharpness, acrid and synthetic. It reminded him of something. The Gulf Coast, 6 years ago. A different smell, but the same category. Industrial chemical, organophosphate family. The particular sweet rot of compounds designed to kill living things efficiently. He had stood on a loading dock in Gulfport, Mississippi, watching dock workers haul shipping drums off a barge, while Gunnar sat at his feet, alerting on every third container. The investigation had taken 18 months. Caleb had built the case methodically, one piece at a time. Samples, chain of custody, lab results, witness statements, cross-referenced shipping manifests. It was airtight. He was sure of it. The shipping company's lawyers had gotten the key evidence suppressed on a procedural technicality. A date stamp. One date stamp, entered incorrectly on a chain of custody form by a junior agent Caleb had been supervising. The judge ruled the samples inadmissible. 18 months of work collapsed in an afternoon. Caleb remembered the sound of the gavel. He remembered walking out of the courthouse into the Mississippi heat and standing on the steps while Gunner leaned against his leg and the sun turned the parking lot into a white blur. 3 dock workers who had been his primary witnesses developed cancers within 3 years. Men who had breathed those chemicals daily while loading drums, who had testified because Caleb had promised them the system worked. By the 5th year, all 3 were dead. Carl Jessup, 51. Dwayne Poole, 44. Richard Almonte, 39. Caleb kept their names in a small leather notebook he carried in his jacket pocket. He did not look at the names often. He did not need to. They were already written somewhere deeper than paper. He sat in the truck for a moment, staring at the sealed soil bags on the passenger seat beside Gunner. The dog leaned over and sniffed the bags once, then looked up at Caleb with steady, amber eyes. The look held no judgment and no expectation, just presence. I know. He drove to the post office and mailed the samples to a state agricultural testing lab in Des Moines. The address came from Ruth Calder. Ruth lived 3 miles north of town, in a clapboard house with a green metal roof and raised herb beds arranged in precise rows behind the kitchen. Caleb had met her at the farmer's market a month earlier, when she had walked up to his stand, picked up a tomato, sniffed it, and said without introduction that his soil pH was probably too alkaline for the variety he was growing. She was 61, lean and erect, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, and a habit of saying exactly what she thought, regardless of whether anyone had asked. She had retired from the County Agricultural Extension Office 4 years ago after 31 years of advising farmers on soil management, crop rotation, and pest control. She knew more about Iowa dirt than most people knew about their own families. Caleb stopped at her house on the way to the post office. She was on the porch, sharpening garden shears, a mug of tea cooling on the railing beside her. Ruth, you mentioned a lab in Des Moines that does independent soil testing. You still have that address? She looked at him over her reading glasses. I do. Why? Found something in the Henderson fields. I want it tested properly. Ruth set the shears down. She studied him for a moment, then went inside and came back with a business card and a handwritten note on the back. State Agricultural Testing Lab, Pesticide Bureau. Ask for Dr. Linda Chen. She's thorough, and she doesn't answer to the county. Ruth handed him the card. Something's been off with the soil around here for 2 years. I filed a report with the county. They told me I was imagining things. What kind of off? Yield anomalies, nitrogen levels that didn't match the fertilizer applications, and a smell in certain fields after rain that I couldn't identify, but I knew wasn't right. She folded her arms. I ran this county's extension program for 3 decades. I'm not a woman who imagines things about dirt. Caleb believed her. He thanked her, took the card, and drove to the post office. On the way, he thought about what Ruth had said. 2 years. The AgriCorp processing facility had been operational for 3. Whatever was happening in those fields had started shortly after the plant opened its doors. On the drive home, Caleb passed the First Lutheran Church on Maple Street. The marquee sign out front read, in black removable letters, Harvest Blessing, October 12th. Come as you are. He kept driving. Dust on the air, sweet and dry, lifting from the gravel lot as a silver sedan pulled into the market Saturday morning. October sun, warmer than it should have been. The light falling heavy on the canopies and crate displays and the worn asphalt of the parking area. Caleb was arranging banana peppers when the woman stepped out. She was not from Briar Station, or rather, she was from Briar Station, but had left long enough ago that the town had reshaped itself around her absence. Elena Voss, 48 years old, wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, dark slacks, low heels, dressed for a regional office, not a Saturday morning market. She walked along the vendor row with the comfortable smile of a person who had learned to make any room feel like hers. She stopped at every stand, bought honey, tasted a sample of goat cheese, spoke to the hat-knitting woman by name. By the time she reached Caleb's table, she had a canvas bag over her shoulder and the measured warmth of someone building goodwill before asking for something. These are beautiful. Are you Caleb Mercer? I am. Elena Voss. I'm the regional director for Harlan AgriCorp. We have offices in Des Moines, but I grew up here. Went to Briar Station Elementary, if you can believe it. She picked up a tomato, turned it in her hand. This is a brandy wine, isn't it? Cherokee purple. Even better. You know your varieties. She set the tomato down gently. I understand you're leasing the Kirshner acreage on the south side. 12 acres? 11.5. Gunnar had risen from beneath the table. He stood between Caleb and the woman, body positioned sideways, a solid wall of black and tan fur at hip height. His ears were forward, but his posture was different from the chemical alert. This was assessment. Social. Deciding. Elena looked down at the dog. He's gorgeous. Retired working dog? Coast Guard. My father had shepherds. Never one that well trained, though. She returned her attention to Caleb with the practiced ease of someone who understood that complimenting a man's dog was the fastest way to lower his guard. I'll be direct. AgriCorp is expanding our local supplier network, sourcing produce from small farms in the region for our employee commissary program and partner restaurants. We'd love to include Mercer Farm. The terms are generous. Volume commitments, guaranteed purchase prices above market rate, and we handle distribution. Caleb studied her. Not the words, the delivery. He had spent 7 years as a CGIS special agent at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, learning to read people the way mechanics read engines. He watched her hands, still, controlled, the right thumb rubbing the index finger in a small circle she probably did not know she did. Her eye contact was steady but calibrated, breaking at intervals that felt natural but were not. Her voice carried genuine warmth layered over something rehearsed, like a song performed so many times the singer had forgotten where feeling ended and technique began. Appreciate the offer, but I sell what I grow right here. That's the whole operation. Something moved behind Elena's eyes. Quick. Not anger. Recalibration. The smile remained, but the temperature dropped half a degree. Of course. No pressure. She adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder. Then she looked past him, toward the grain elevator visible above the tree line on Route 14. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something different. Not the rehearsed pitch, something underneath it. Caleb. Can I call you Caleb? This town was dying before AgriCorp came. She turned back to him. I grew up here. I remember what poverty looked like. My mother cleaned houses for the families who still had money. My father drove a feed truck until his back gave out and they replaced him with a younger man who'd work for less. Empty storefronts, families leaving. The school almost closed twice. We kept this town alive. Whatever you may think about big agriculture, we kept it alive. Caleb said nothing. He watched her face as she spoke about her parents and saw something he had not expected to see. Not performance, not manipulation, but memory. Genuine. The kind that lived in the body, not the script. It complicated things. I appreciate what AgriCorp has done for the community. That's all I'm saying. The warmth returned to her voice, smooth and practiced again. The moment of vulnerability sealed over. The offer stands. No deadline. You think about it. It was convincing because part of it was true. Caleb could see the new grain elevator on the north side of town from where he stood. The AgriCorp logo painted across its side in green and white. The repaved Main Street. The hardware store that should have closed a decade ago, but had not. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. She bought 2 pounds of tomatoes, paid cash, and left the way she had arrived, greeting everyone, leaving warmth behind her like perfume. Gunnar sat down only after her car disappeared around the corner on Route 14. Caleb stood at his table for a long moment, one hand resting on a crate of tomatoes, watching the dust settle in the lot where Elena's sedan had been. She had known his name, his acreage, his branch of service. That level of preparation meant she had looked into him before driving to a Saturday morning farmer's market to buy Cherokee purples. Which meant the visit was not about tomatoes, and never had been. That evening, Caleb found an envelope in his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet. Laboratory analysis from the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Pesticide Bureau. 3 soil samples, all 3 positive for chlorpyrifos, a restricted-use organophosphate, at concentrations 4 times the federal safety threshold. He read the numbers standing in his kitchen. Gunnar lying on the floor near the stove, the evening light turning the room amber through the west-facing window. The house smelled like the basil plant on the windowsill and the cedar boards he had been sanding for the kitchen shelf. Simple smells. A simple life. The one he had come here to build. The numbers on the lab sheet were not simple. 4 times the threshold meant the compound was not residual contamination from years past. It was active. current, being applied now, this season, through equipment that sprayed it directly onto soil where food was grown and water drained, and children played in parks downstream. He set the paper on the counter and opened the leather notebook from his jacket pocket. 3 names: Carl Jessup, Dwayne Poole, Richard Almonte. He did not read them. He just held the notebook open for a moment, then closed it again. Guess we're not done. Gunner's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. The dog did not lift his head, but his tail swept once across the floorboards. A single stroke, like a broom clearing a path. 4 times the limit. All 3 farms. And a woman who believed that poisoning them was the price of keeping them alive. The smell of frying onions drifted from the kitchen of the Route 14 diner at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, mixing with coffee steam and the particular grease and maple scent that diners acquire over decades and never fully lose. Caleb sat in the 3rd booth from the door, back to the wall, facing the entrance, Gunner lying beneath the table with his chin on Caleb's boot. Old habits. A man who had spent years working federal investigations in port cities and coastal towns never sat with his back to the door, the same way he never left a building without noting the exits, the same way he always parked facing outward in case he needed to leave in a hurry. He did not think about these things anymore. They were automatic, muscle memory from a life he had technically left behind. He spread a county map across the table, the kind you could buy at the gas station for $3, and marked the 3 contaminated farms with small red circles. Henderson, south section. The Paulson place, 2 miles east. The Fisher acreage, 4 miles north along the creek. 3 properties, 3 separate operations, 1 common factor. All 3 purchased agricultural supplies, fertilizer, herbicide, seed treatment, from Harlan AgriCorp's local distribution center on Industrial Road, a corrugated metal building on the west edge of town. He drew a line connecting them. Then he drew another line to the AgriCorp facility he had driven past twice in the last week. A larger building, newer, set back from the county road behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. An old farmer named Clyde Jessup, no relation to any Jessup Caleb had known, slid into the booth across from him without invitation. He was 80 if he was a day, with hearing aids in both ears and a voice calibrated for a tractor cab. "You looking at that AgriCorp plant?" "Just mapping the county. I watched them build it 3 years ago. Trucks running day and night for 6 months. You know what kind of fence they put up? Razor wire. Razor wire." Clyde tapped the map with a crooked finger. "I've been farming this county since Eisenhower. Nobody puts razor wire around fertilizer. You put razor wire around things you don't want people seeing." "Did anyone ask about it?" "I asked. Called the county office. They said it was standard security for chemical storage." He snorted. "Standard. I store ammonium nitrate in a tin shed with a padlock." Clyde left when his eggs arrived at the counter. Caleb watched him go, then looked back at his map. The sign at the AgriCorp gate read, "Harlan AgriCorp, Nutrient Processing Facility." It had been built 3 years ago. Caleb remembered seeing the construction from the highway when he first moved to town. Razor wire and all. Linda Wynne brought his coffee. She was 53, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the efficient warmth of a woman who had been waitressing long enough to know which customers wanted conversation and which wanted to be left alone. Caleb had always been the second kind. This morning, something shifted. "Refill?" "Please. Linda, you've been here a while, right? 20 years or so?" 23. Longer than some of the buildings on this street. Why? "When did AgriCorp set up in town?" Linda topped off his mug and set the pot on the table edge, a gesture that meant she intended to stay a moment. "About 5 years ago. Started with the distribution center. Then they built that big facility out on Industrial. Most people were happy. Brought jobs, stabilized the tax base." She tilted her head. "The Hendersons used their product. So do the Paulsons and the Fishers and half the farms in the county. Did they have a choice?" Linda's expression changed. She picked up the coffee pot again, held it against her hip. "Well, that's a funny thing. Old man Fisher tried switching suppliers last spring. Something about the cost going up. 2 weeks later, the bank called about his operating loan. Wanted to renegotiate terms." She lowered her voice. "He switched back. I heard the Paulsons got the same call." Caleb looked at his map again. 3 farms, 3 operating loans. 1 agricultural supplier that also happened, through a subsidiary he had discovered in county records that morning, to service most of the farm mortgages in the region. The product flowed one direction. The money flowed the other. And at the center, a company that controlled both. "Linda, your daughter teaches at the elementary school, right?" "Emily, yeah, 2nd grade. Why?" "The school, it's on Vine Street, north side of town. Right next to the community park. The kids play out there every day at recess. It's a nice setup." She paused, studying his face. "Why do you ask, Caleb? You're making that face." "What face?" "The one where you look like you're deciding whether to tell someone something they don't want to hear." Caleb looked at his map. The Fisher acreage, the northernmost contaminated farm, bordered a section of land that ran within 300 yards of Vine Street. The irrigation runoff from that farm drained into a seasonal creek that passed along the east side of the community park, where children ran at recess. Just being neighborly. Checking on things. Linda looked at him for a moment longer. Then she topped off his coffee again, though the mug was already full, and moved on to the next booth. He folded the map carefully, paid for his coffee, and left a tip that was larger than usual. Linda called after him with a cheerful goodbye. He did not hear it. In the truck, Gunnar looked at him from the passenger seat. The dog had accepted a piece of bacon from Linda without leaving his position under the table. A moment of ordinary life that now felt very far away. Caleb drove west on Industrial Road, past the distribution center, past the propane dealer, past the county recycling drop-off. The road narrowed after the last building, gravel replacing asphalt, fields opening on both sides. Then the fence appeared. The AgriCorp processing facility sat at the end of the road, set back 200 yards from the county boundary behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The sign at the gate was green and white, corporate-clean. Harlan AgriCorp, nutrient processing facility. No unauthorized entry. 2 trucks were parked inside the gate, neither of them farm equipment. A thin curl of vapor rose from a vent on the building's flat roof and dissolved into the clean Iowa sky. He pulled onto the shoulder and studied the building. Old habit. Assess before approach. Razor wire along the top of the fence, the kind that cost 3 times standard barbed wire and served no purpose on a fertilizer operation. Security cameras at the gate posts, angled to cover both the road and the entrance. Motion-activated lights on the building corners, industrial grade, the kind designed for nighttime perimeter security. And the building itself was sealed tight. No open loading bays, no ventilation louvers on the walls, no visible windows on the ground floor. Everything closed, filtered, contained. For a nutrient processing plant in the middle of Iowa farm country, it had more perimeter security than some of the port facilities Caleb had investigated during his Coast Guard years. Gunnar had risen in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the cracked window. Even from the shoulder of the road, 200 yards out, the dog's nostrils were working. Not alerting, sampling, filing information for later. Yeah, I see it too. Caleb noted the camera positions in his memory, counted the vehicles, memorized the access road layout, the drainage ditch along the east side, the tree line to the north, where the property butted against an unused section of farmland. A man could approach from the north without being visible from the gate cameras, if he knew the angles, if he had walked perimeters before. He filed that thought away and drove on. At the diner that morning, the world had been onions and coffee, and a waitress whose daughter taught second grade 300 yards from a poisoned field. By afternoon, the world was soil data and a county map with red circles that all pointed to the same company, the same product, the same facility at the end of a dead-end road. Every farm, every mortgage, every bag of product, and an elementary school playground where children ran at recess on soil fed by water that no one had thought to test. The first farmer talked. His name was Hank Ullman. He was 62 years old, leased 300 acres of corn and soybean from a trust held by a family in Cedar Rapids, and had hands so large and weathered they looked like they belonged to a man 10 years older. Caleb found him on a Thursday afternoon, mending a fence along the southern boundary of his property, the smell of rust and fresh-cut wire mixing with the cold autumn air. Gunnar stayed in the truck, watching through the open window, ears tracking the conversation he could not hear. Mr. Ullman, I'm Caleb Mercer. I run the produce stand at the Saturday market. I know who you are. Bought your tomatoes last month. Best I've had since my wife stopped growing her own. I'd like to ask you about Harlan AgriCorp. Ullman's hand stopped moving on the fence wire. He looked up at Caleb, then past him at the road. A long look, deliberate, checking, then back at the fence. What about them? Do you use their product? The nutrient treatment they distribute through the local center? Everybody does. By choice? Ullman pulled the fence wire tight and twisted it with pliers. His jaw worked beneath his beard. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its shadow passing across the fence line and the 2 men standing on either side of it. When Ullman spoke again, his voice was lower. Last April, I called their office, said I wanted to try a different fertilizer supplier. Nothing dramatic, just wanted to compare prices. He paused. 2 weeks later, First Agricultural Bank called about my operating loan. Said they needed to review my terms. Mentioned something about collateral reappraisal. He looked at Caleb. I've had that loan for 14 years. Never missed a payment. They'd never called before. You switched back? What do you think? Caleb thanked him and drove to the next farm on his list, the Paulson place, 2 miles east. A woman answered the door, mid-40s, flour on her hands, 2 children visible behind her, in a kitchen that smelled like bread. Mrs. Paulson, I'm Caleb Mercer. I know who you are. She looked past him at the truck, at Gunnar watching from the passenger window. My husband said you'd come. I'd like to... The door closed. Not slammed. Closed. The lock clicked. Behind the door, one of the children said something Caleb could not hear, and the woman's voice answered, soft and tired. Nobody, honey. Go finish your homework. Caleb stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the closed door. Through the kitchen window, he could see the woman standing at the counter, hands flat on the surface, head down. She was breathing slowly, the way people breathe when they are trying very hard not to cry. He walked back to his truck. Gunnar tilted his head as Caleb climbed in, reading his expression. Yeah, that went about how I expected. He drove home. The sun dropped lower. The fields turned from gold to copper to shadow. The gravel crunched under tires that were not his. Caleb was unloading boxes from his truck at the farmhouse when he heard the car. Late afternoon, the sun already sitting heavy and orange on the western tree line, turning the fields amber. He set the box down on the porch railing and waited. Elena Voss's silver sedan rolled up the driveway and stopped behind his truck. She stepped out slowly, wearing a different coat than the one from the market, heavier, darker, more practical. Her face carried no smile this time. The warmth she had worn like an accessory on Saturday was absent. Gunnar emerged from behind the house, where he had been lying in a patch of late sun near the garden fence. He positioned himself beside Caleb on the porch steps, body angled toward Elena, ears forward and still. Not alerting, assessing. Elena? Caleb. She stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up at him. You've been busy. Just getting to know the neighbors. You've been driving to farms, asking questions, showing people soil data. Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge beneath it now, thin and sharp, like a blade under cloth. People are talking. People should talk. They've been quiet too long. Elena glanced at Gunnar, then back at Caleb. She climbed 2 steps and stopped, close enough for conversation, but not close enough to reach the porch. You're asking questions that worry people, Chief. The word landed deliberately. Chief. His former rank. She had used it at the market, too, casually, as if it were just a name. But standing on his porch steps with the sun going down, the word carried a different weight. It said, I know what you were. I know what you are trained to do. And I want you to know that I know. Then maybe the right people are getting worried. I am not the enemy here, Caleb. She folded her arms. I didn't come here to threaten you. I came because I think you're a reasonable man who doesn't understand the full picture. She looked out at the fields beyond the house. Do you know what this county looked like 10 years ago? Before AgriCorp? I do, because I grew up in it. My mother cleaned houses for $12 an hour. My father drove a feed truck until his back broke and they gave his route to someone younger and cheaper. Her voice dropped. Briar Station was disappearing. Not fast, not dramatic, just fading. One closed shop at a time. One family moving away at a time. The school board talked about consolidation every year. She turned back to him. Agricorp changed that. We brought stable employment. We invested in infrastructure. We kept the bank open, the hardware store running, the grain elevator modernized. I'm not pretending the cost is zero. Nothing is free. But you think poverty is healthier than pesticide? You think watching a town die is better than managing the risks that keep it alive? Caleb did not answer immediately. He stood on the porch with Gunnar rigid beside him and looked at Elena Voss standing on his steps, the failing light catching the gray at her temples. She believed what she was saying. That was the trouble. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. She had clawed her way out of this town and then been sent back to manage it. And somewhere between the clawing and the managing, she had convinced herself that the harm was a necessary cost. He thought about what she had said about her mother cleaning houses, about her father losing his root. He thought about the empty storefronts she had described and the school that nearly closed. And he measured those things against the dead circles in the Henderson field and the man in a hospital bed with chemicals in his blood. Two kinds of poison. One you could see on a lab report. The other you lived inside until it felt normal. I think you should leave. The offer still stands. The contract, the partnership. It's a good deal, Caleb. That's not what I mean. I mean, you should leave my property. Something shifted in Elena's expression. Not defeat. Recognition. She had read him the same way he had read her at the market. And what she saw now was a man who had decided. She nodded once, turned, and walked back to her car. At the door, she paused. I'm not the villain you need me to be. She drove away. The taillights shrank along the driveway and disappeared onto the county road. Gunnar watched until the sound of her engine faded completely, then walked to the edge of the porch, circled once, and lay down facing the road. Guard position. He would stay there until dark. She knew his rank. She knew his branch. And she had made a point that sat in his chest like a splinter, because it was not entirely wrong. Poverty and poison. Two kinds of dying. She had chosen the one she could manage. Caleb wondered if she still believed she could. Stars. Millions of them. The Iowa sky at night in October was so wide and clear that the Milky Way looked like a road someone had paved across the darkness with crushed quartz. The air smelled of cold earth and dead corn stalks, and the faintest trace of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney half a mile south. Caleb walked the section road with Gunnar at his side. Midnight. Neither of them could sleep. His right shoulder ached. It always ached in cold weather. The old boarding injury. The mooring line scar on his palm tightening when the temperature dropped. He rolled the joint slowly as he walked, a habit he no longer noticed. The road was empty. Gravel under his boots, the soft pad of Gunnar's paws beside him, and the enormous quiet of a landscape with no hills to interrupt the wind. 3 miles of flat land in every direction, broken only by tree lines and grain elevators and the occasional glow of a farmhouse window. He was thinking about the Gulf Coast case. Not the flashback kind of thinking, not the smell-triggered, body-locked kind that had ambushed him in the Henderson field. This was deliberate. Reckoning. Last time he had built a case by the book. Evidence collection, chain of custody, lab analysis, witness statements, jurisdictional coordination. 18 months of careful, methodical, regulation-compliant investigation. And a single miswritten date on a single form had brought all of it down. Not because the evidence was wrong, not because the witnesses lied, because the system required perfection from the people trying to stop the harm, and required nothing at all from the people causing it. He had followed the rules. 3 men had died. The section road curved west. In the distance, beyond a stand of bare cottonwoods, the AgriCorp processing facility sat dark against the sky. No exterior lights at this hour, except the security lamps at the gate, casting orange cones across the gravel entrance. The building was a black rectangle. The vapor vent on the roof was invisible against the stars. Come on. He left the road and walked north through the harvested field bordering the facility property. The stubble was ankle-high, frozen crisp, crunching faintly with each step. Gunnar moved beside him in the dark, body low and quiet, his coat blending into the shadow between rows. A working dog on patrol. The old training activated without command. They reached the tree line along the north perimeter. Caleb crouched behind a cottonwood and studied the fence. From this angle, the security cameras at the gate pointed south and east. Standard coverage pattern, efficient but incomplete. The north fence was unmonitored. Razor wire along the top, but the chain link itself was standard 12-gauge. No motion sensors that he could see. He moved along the tree line toward the east side, where the facility's drainage ditch ran parallel to the fence before emptying into a culvert under the county road. The smell hit him when he was 30 yards from the fence. Sharp, chemical, stronger than anything he had detected in the fields. This was source-level concentration, a full-strength compound escaping through ventilation or waste systems. Gunnar. Such. The shepherd went rigid. Full chemical detection alert, ears flat forward, body low, nose locked on the fence line. Then he barked. One sharp, percussive sound that split the silence like a rifle crack. Caleb grabbed his collar. Easy, easy. Gunnar fell silent, but his body vibrated beneath Caleb's hand, every muscle taut, nostrils flaring in rapid pulls. Whatever compound was inside that building, the concentration at the fence line was enough to trigger the strongest alert Caleb had ever seen from this dog. Stronger than any narcotics interdiction, stronger than the Gulf Coast shipping drums. This was not residual. This was active production. Then headlights swept across the access road. A truck. White. Coming fast from the south, engine growling as it turned onto the facility's service road. Security patrol. Caleb dropped flat behind the drainage berm, one hand still on Gunnar's collar, the frozen dirt slamming into his bad shoulder hard enough to send a bolt of white pain through his arm. Plots. Gunnar went flat, chin on the ground, body pressed into the dead grass, invisible in the dark. 4 years of Coast Guard training overriding 6 years of retirement in a single syllable. The truck rolled along the inside of the fence, 20 feet away. A spotlight mounted on the cab swept the fence line in a slow arc. White light crawled across the grass where they had been standing 3 seconds earlier. It passed over the drainage berm, catching the top edge, but not the depression behind it where Caleb and Gunnar lay motionless. Caleb counted heartbeats. Old combat habit. 12, 13, 14. The spotlight moved on. The truck continued its circuit toward the south gate. He waited another 60 seconds, then rolled onto his back and stared at the stars. His shoulder screamed. Gunnar remained flat beside him, breathing quietly, eyes tracking the retreating taillights. Good boy. Good boy. They crawled back to the tree line and walked the section road home. Caleb's hands were shaking. Not fear, but adrenaline. The old familiar surge that had powered 1,000 boarding operations and nighttime interdictions during his years on the water. His body remembered, even when his mind insisted those days were over. Whatever they were making inside that building, they were guarding it like a forward operating base. And whatever Gunnar had smelled at that fence line, it was not fertilizer. Caleb called a number he had not dialed in 2 years. The phone rang 4 times. A voice answered, wary and half asleep. Mercer? Hey, Joe. Sorry about the hour. It's 11:30, Caleb. I'm not asleep. I'm watching a terrible movie. What do you need? Lieutenant Commander Sarah Cho, still active in the Coast Guard Investigative Service, stationed at the CGIS field office in New Orleans. She and Caleb had worked 3 cases together during his final years in the service, including the Gulf Coast investigation. She was the one person in the federal system he still trusted enough to call. I need a quiet background check on an EPA permit. Facility in Iowa. Harlan AgriCorp. You retired, Caleb. I know. You moved to Iowa to grow vegetables. I know that too. What kind of permit? Chemical processing. Their public filing says agricultural nutrient processing. I have reason to believe they're manufacturing something that doesn't match the permit. Cho was silent for a moment. Then, give me the facility address. I'll pull the EPA file tomorrow. Don't do anything stupid in the meantime. Appreciate it. Caleb, if this is what you think it is, you need to hand it off. You're not CGIS anymore. I know. You keep saying that like it means something. Call me back in 24 hours. The line went dead. Cho called back in 16. I pulled the EPA file, also ran the company through the Federal Enforcement Database. And? The facility's EPA permit is for agricultural nutrient processing. Class 3, low-risk category. No chemical manufacturing license. No hazardous materials handling authorization. No RCRA storage permit for hazardous waste. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted from the brisk efficiency of a colleague into something closer to the tone she had used during joint investigations, when a case stopped being routine. But here's what's interesting. Harlan AgriCorp has 7 facilities nationwide. 2 in Texas, 1 in Georgia, 1 in Kansas, 2 in Nebraska, and this one in Iowa. The Iowa facility is the only one permitted as nutrient processing. The other 6 are all licensed as pesticide formulation plants. Same company. Same infrastructure, different permit. Exactly. And the Iowa facility was built 3 years ago, right after the EPA fined their Kansas plant $2 million for improper handling of restricted use pesticides. Draw your own conclusions. They moved production to a facility where nobody was looking. That's not an official assessment. That's you talking. Can you open a case? Not from here. CGIS handles maritime and port jurisdiction. This is inland, agricultural. You need EPA Region 7 or the Iowa AG's office. But I can flag it in the interagency system. That puts it on someone's radar. How long does radar take to become action? Honestly, months. Maybe longer if the company has lawyers, which they will. Companies like this budget for enforcement delays. They know the system moves slower than the damage. Caleb, I need to say this clearly. Whatever you're thinking about doing yourself, don't. You're a civilian now. You have no shield, no backup, no qualified immunity. If you push this wrong, they'll bury you before they bury the evidence. I hear you. Do you? Because I've heard that tone before, and it usually means you're about to do exactly what I told you not to. Caleb hung up and stood at his kitchen window for a long time, watching the fields turn gold in the morning light. Months. The Gulf Coast case had taken 18 months, and 3 men had died during the waiting. The system responded to pressure, not patience. And the only pressure available in Briar Station was public pressure. He picked up his jacket and his truck keys. The grain elevator on Route 14 was a tall concrete structure built in the 1970s and modernized 3 years ago with AgriCorp funding. New loading equipment, digital scales, expanded storage capacity. The AgriCorp logo was painted on the south face in green and white, visible from half a mile away. Tomas Reyes had collapsed on the loading dock 10 days earlier. Caleb parked near the rail siding and let Gunnar out. The elevator was quiet today. No trucks loading, no workers visible. He walked the loading dock slowly. Concrete floor, metal railings, grain dust in every crack and seam. The October wind pushed through the open structure, carrying the smell of wheat and diesel. Gunnar stayed at heel for 30 seconds. Then he broke. The dog surged forward, nose to the ground, pulling toward the base of the elevator's old loading platform. A section of cinderblock wall, cracked and weathered, ran along the foundation where the original structure met the newer addition. Gunnar's detection posture activated, ears flat, body low, pawing at a gap between 2 blocks near the base of the wall. Caleb knelt beside him. The gap was narrow, maybe 4 inches wide, where a cinder block had shifted over the years, creating a cavity behind the wall facing. Gunnar's nose was pressed into the opening, his whole body rigid with focus. What did you find? He pulled a penlight from his jacket and aimed it into the gap. Something glinted. Plastic. He used his sleeve to reach inside. Careful, no direct fingerprints, chain of custody. And drew out a small object wrapped in a sandwich bag, sealed with tape. A phone. Cheap, prepaid. The kind you could buy at any gas station for $30. It had been wedged deliberately into the cavity, pushed deep behind the loose cinder block where no casual observer would notice it, but where a dog with chemical detection training would find residue from the hands that had hidden it. Caleb powered it on. The screen lit up, cracked in one corner but functional. No passcode. He opened the photo gallery. Thumbnails filled the screen, dozens of them. He tapped the first. A loading dock. Not this one, the Agricorp facility on Industrial Road. Nighttime, the image grainy but clear enough. A truck backed up to an open bay. 2 men in coveralls loading drums. White, unmarked, no labels, no hazmat placards, onto the truck bed. The timestamp read 3:12 a.m., August 23rd. He swiped. Another image. Same facility, different angle. The drums stacked inside the building, rows of them, floor to ceiling. No Agricorp logo, no product markings. Just white drums in an unlabeled warehouse. He swiped again. Video this time. Shaky footage, clearly shot from hiding. A truck departing the facility at 2:47 a.m. Drums visible in the bed, turning south onto the county road toward the distribution center. 23 images, 6 videos. Timestamps spanning from August 14th to October 1st. The date, Caleb realized, 3 days before Tomas Reyes collapsed at this very grain elevator. Tomas had not been a careless worker who happened to get sick. He had been documenting what was happening inside that plant for 2 months. He had been building a case, and he had hidden the evidence in the one place the company would never think to look. A wall cavity at a public grain elevator, far from the bunkhouse where company representatives could search his belongings. A migrant farm worker. No badge, no training, no federal authority. He had seen something wrong and documented it with a $30 phone, hiding evidence in a crack in a wall because he had no office, no filing cabinet, no chain of custody forms. He had done what Caleb had once been paid to do, and he had done it alone, without a partner, without a weapon, without any of the institutional protections that Caleb had carried like armor for 22 years. And he had nearly died for it. Caleb sat back on his heels. His hands were trembling. Not adrenaline this time. Something else. He looked at the phone in his palm. Cracked screen, plastic case scratched from being hidden in a wall, and thought about the hands that had put it there. Hands that picked crops. Hands that earned less in a month than a CGIS agent earned in a week. Hands that had held this phone steady enough to record video in the dark at 3 in the morning, knowing that being caught would mean losing the only job that kept food on a table somewhere. Gunnar stood beside him, tail still, eyes fixed on the phone. "You know what this is, buddy?" The dog's ears shifted forward. "This is what courage looks like when nobody's watching." He sat on the loading dock for several minutes, the cold concrete beneath him, the grain elevator creaking in the wind above. The phone felt heavier than it should have. $30 of plastic and circuitry, carrying 2 months of a man's silent war against a company that could crush him without noticing. Caleb thought about his own investigation tools. The CGIS badge, the Federal Warrant Authority, the laboratory access, the interagency databases, the legal framework that had surrounded him like scaffolding for 22 years. Tomas Reyes had none of that. He had a phone and a crack in a wall, and the decision to act anyway. The pesticide was not being shipped into Briar Station from somewhere else. It was being manufactured here, in the facility at the end of Industrial Road, in drums without labels, loaded at 3 in the morning and distributed to farms whose owners had no idea what they were putting on their soil. The town was not a victim of distant corporate negligence. It was the production site. Good boy, Gunner. Real good boy. Ruth Calder's kitchen table was covered with paper. Soil test results. The county map with its red circles. Printouts of Agricorp's corporate filings that Caleb had pulled from public records at the county clerk's office. And now, in the center of the table, a sealed evidence bag containing Tomas Reyes's phone. Ruth sat across from him, with her reading glasses on her nose and her tea going cold. She had not spoken for 3 minutes. They're manufacturing it. Yes. Here, in Briar Station, in that building I've driven past 100 times. Unlicensed, unlabeled, distributed to farms through their own supply chain. Ruth took off her glasses and set them on the table. Her hands were steady, but her face had gone pale beneath her tan. I knew the soil was wrong. I knew it for 2 years. But I thought it was contamination from a bad batch of fertilizer, a supply chain error. I never imagined someone was making it on purpose. Neither did I, until the dog found the phone. Ruth looked at Gunner, who lay on the kitchen floor with his chin on his paws, eyes moving between the 2 humans. What do we do now? Caleb leaned forward. His hands were flat on the table, palms down, the scar on his right hand visible in the kitchen light. The CGIS investigator in him had already assembled the answer before she finished asking. First, chain of custody. This phone is evidence. I've photographed it in situ at the grain elevator, taken GPS coordinates of the hiding spot, documented the recovery with timestamps. I'll copy the contents to a USB drive tonight. The originals stay sealed. Because last time, a date stamp on a custody form killed an 18-month investigation. I'm not making that mistake again. Ruth looked at him steadily. You blame yourself for those men. I supervised the agent who made the error. I should have checked the form myself. You built an 18-month case against a company with a $100 million legal budget. 1 date stamp. 1 date stamp was enough. And 3 men died because the system let a typo outweigh the truth. Ruth leaned back in her chair. That's not your fault, Caleb. That's the system's fault. Doesn't matter whose fault it was. They're still dead. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Gunner shifted on the kitchen floor, his chin sliding from one paw to the other. Then Ruth spoke again, softer now. So this time, you're not relying on the system alone. This time, I'm putting the evidence in a room full of people where no lawyer can suppress it and no judge can rule it inadmissible. Public record. 200 witnesses. You'll need the right authority in that room. I need the state attorney general, someone with jurisdiction over agricultural fraud. Ruth pulled a business card from the pocket of her flannel shirt and slid it across the table. Assistant Attorney General, Agricultural Fraud Division. Her name is Margaret Hale. She comes to the County Harvest Festival every year. It's part of her office's community outreach. Caleb picked up the card. The Harvest Festival. When is that? October 12th, 2 weeks from Saturday. Can you get us speaking time at the public forum? Ruth studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once.
I can. But Caleb, what you're describing isn't a panel discussion. It's a public accusation against the largest employer in the county. People in this town owe their mortgages to Agricorp, their jobs, their children's school funding, their children's health, too. They just don't know it yet. Some of them won't thank you for telling them. I know, but it's a presentation of evidence to a state official in a public setting. Big difference. Not to the people in that room. Caleb looked at the evidence bag on the table, at the soil results, at the county map with its red circles and its lines all pointing to one building at the end of a dead-end road. The evidence has to be undeniable, not just paper, something the room can see, something that can't be argued away by a corporate lawyer. Ruth raised an eyebrow. Such as? Caleb looked at Gunnar. The dog looked back at him with steady, amber eyes. Such as a live demonstration. That afternoon, Caleb's produce stand permit was revoked. The letter arrived by certified mail. County seal embossed on the envelope. Official language inside. Pursuant to County Health Ordinance 14-7, your temporary vendor permit has been suspended pending investigation of potential soil contamination on the leased parcel identified as Kirchner South, Briar Station Township. It was signed by the county health inspector, a man named Gerald Fry, whom Caleb had never met, and whose office, a quick phone call revealed, had never conducted a single inspection of the Agricorp-supplied farms in the county. He stood on his porch reading it while Gunnar lay at his feet. The irony was precise enough to be intentional. His produce, organic, untreated, grown on soil he had tested and knew to be clean, was being shut down for contamination. Meanwhile, 3 farms soaked in banned pesticide continued to operate without a single visit from Gerald Fry's office. He thought about his tomatoes, the Cherokee purples that still hung heavy on the vines, the late peppers, the winter squash he had been curing in the barn that no longer existed. 12 acres of food, grown carefully, sold honestly, to people who came to his table every Saturday because they trusted what he grew. Gone. Not because of anything wrong with his soil, because he had asked questions about someone else's. The county notice blew off the porch railing in a gust of October wind. Gunnar stood, trotted after it across the yard, caught the paper in his mouth, and brought it back. He set it at Caleb's feet and looked up, tail still, waiting for acknowledgement. Thanks, buddy. He folded the notice and put it in his jacket pocket beside the leather notebook with the 3 names. Carl Jessup, Dwayne Poole, Richard Almonte. 3 men who had died while he followed procedure and waited for the system to work. They had shut his stand down. 12 acres of tomatoes with nowhere to sell. 2 years of building something simple and clean, dismantled in a single certified letter. And somewhere in a corporate office, the machinery of pressure had ground another small thing into powder. Not this time, he said to no one. This time, the chain holds. Caleb visited farms, not with soil data this time, and not with the phone evidence. He was saving that for the festival. He visited with the truth, delivered the same way he had once delivered investigation findings to federal prosecutors. Directly, without embellishment, without apology. He drove to the Brennan property first. Walt Brennan was 73 years old and ran the largest remaining independent farm operation in the county. 400 acres of corn and soy, machinery worth $500,000, and a reputation for silence that even the other quiet farmers in Briar Station considered exceptional. He had attended the same church for 50 years, served on the county fair board for 30, and spoken at public meetings approximately never. Walt's wife, Dorothy, had been sick for 2 years. Fatigue that no amount of rest could fix. Joint pain that migrated from her hands to her knees to her spine. Weight loss that the doctors in Marion could not explain. She had been seen by 3 specialists in 3 cities. None of them had asked about the water supply. None of them had tested for organophosphate exposure. Because nobody tests for poison when the poison comes through the kitchen faucet. Caleb found Walt in his machine shed, cleaning a combine header. He brought Gunner with him. The shed was loud with compressor hiss, but Walt shut it off the moment he saw them approach, and the sudden quiet seemed to widen the space between the 2 men. "Walt? Mercer? Got a minute?" Walt looked at Gunner. The shepherd walked forward without command, crossed the concrete floor of the machine shed, and sat down beside Walt's workbench. Calmly, deliberately, as if he had chosen the old farmer specifically from the population of all the people in the county. Walt looked down at the dog for a long moment, then reached out and scratched behind one dark ear with a grease-stained hand. "Good-looking dog. He's got good judgment. I'm going to tell you something, and I'd like you to hear it through before you respond." "That's how I do most things," Caleb told him. "The soil results, the dead circles, the banned compound at 4 times the legal threshold, the financial coercion pattern, the facility manufacturing unlicensed chemicals at the end of Industrial Road, the hidden phone, the evidence." He told it flat, procedural, without drama, the same cadence he had used delivering case summaries to federal prosecutors in conference rooms along the Gulf Coast. Facts, evidence, conclusions. Walt listened without moving. His hand rested on Gunner's head throughout, the dog sitting motionless beside his leg. Walt's face was unreadable, lined and brown from decades of sun, his eyes pale and steady beneath the brim of a feed cap that had faded from red to pink. When Caleb finished, Walt was quiet for a long time. Gunner leaned slightly against the old man's leg. "Dorothy's been drinking water from the well, same well that draws from the aquifer that runs under the north section. The section where you've been applying Agricorp product." Walt turned away. He put both hands on the workbench and stood there, head down, for nearly 30 seconds. His shoulders rose and fell once with a deep breath. Gunner stayed beside him, not pressing, just present. "If I testify, if I stand up and say this in public, they'll call my loan. We'll lose the farm. Maybe 400 acres. My father's land. His father's before that." He paused. His fingers tightened on the workbench edge, knuckles white against the scarred wood. "I cleared the North 40 myself when I was 23. Pulled stumps with a chain and a John Deere that was already old when my father bought it. Dorothy packed my lunch every day that summer. Bologna sandwiches and lemonade. She was strong then.
30 years of strong. And now she can barely walk from the bed to the bathroom.
I know. But Dorothy, his voice caught. He pressed his lips together and stared at the workbench. Gunnar leaned his weight slightly against the old man's leg, warm and solid. Walt looked down at the dog. After a moment, his hand moved from the workbench to Gunnar's head, and his fingers settled into the fur behind the dog's ear. I'm presenting evidence at the Harvest Festival. Public forum. State AG will be present. I'm not asking you to stand alone, Walt. I'm asking if you'll stand at all. If others do, that's fair. The fire started at 2 in the morning. Caleb was asleep in the back bedroom of the farmhouse when Gunnar's growl woke him. Low, continuous, rising from somewhere deep in the dog's chest. Not the sharp bark of a detection alert. Something more primal. Warning. Caleb sat up. The room was dark. Gunnar stood at the window, body rigid, hackles raised, staring through the glass at something outside. Orange light. Caleb was on his feet and at the window in 2 seconds. The storage barn. 50 yards south of the house, the corrugated metal building where he kept his market equipment, crates, the folding table, his harvest tools, was burning. Not smoldering, burning. Flames climbing the west wall in sheets of yellow and white. Smoke pouring from the open doorway in a thick column that caught the wind and rolled north across the fields. He pulled on boots, grabbed his phone, dialed 911 while running down the hallway, Gunnar at his heels. Outside, the heat hit him at 20 yards. The barn was fully involved, metal walls glowing orange, the interior visible through the open bay door as a solid mass of flame. His crates, his equipment, his 2-year investment in a simple life. He stood in the yard and watched it burn. There was nothing to do. No hose would reach, no bucket would matter. A man who had spent 22 years on the water, fighting fires aboard Coast Guard cutters, knew when a structure was beyond saving. And this one had been beyond saving before he opened his eyes. Gunnar pressed against his leg. Caleb put a hand on the dog's head and stood there in the October cold while everything he had built turned to smoke and ash. The heat dried the moisture from his face. Embers rose in spirals, orange against the black sky, climbing until the wind scattered them across the empty fields like seeds that would grow nothing. The smell was wood and metal and something else, something chemical beneath the burning, sweet and acrid, familiar. The fire department arrived in 11 minutes. 2 engines from the Briar Station Volunteer Company, 6 men and 1 woman in turnout gear, working efficiently to contain the fire and prevent it from spreading to the farmhouse. Caleb stood with Gunnar and watched them work. He did not help. He did not speak. He stood in his yard in his boots and an undershirt at 2:30 in the morning and watched 2 years of careful, quiet building collapse into a pile of glowing debris. By the time they had the flames knocked down, the barn was a blackened skeleton of twisted metal and smoldering debris. Steam hissed where water met hot metal. The air tasted like ash. A fine gray powder settled on everything within 100 yards. The truck, the porch railing, Gunnar's coat, the garden fence where the last of the season's squash vines hung brown and curling. It looked like snow. It smelled like ruin.
One of the volunteer firefighters, a young man Caleb recognized from the hardware store, approached him with a bottle of water and the careful expression of someone who does not know what to say. "Mr. Mercer, I'm sorry. Is there anything?" "No, thank you." The young man nodded and walked back to his truck. Dawn was coming. The eastern horizon had turned from black to deep blue, to the first pale line of gray that would eventually become morning. The birds had not started yet. They would wait until the smoke cleared and the engines left and the world returned to something they recognized. The fire marshal came at 7. He walked the perimeter, took photographs, asked Caleb about the building's electrical system. By 9 o'clock, he had his determination. "Electrical fault, old wiring. I'll file the report this afternoon." Caleb looked at the man. The fire marshal was in his 50s, heavy through the middle, with the confident finality of someone who had already written his report before walking the scene. Caleb had interviewed hundreds of witnesses in his CGIS career. He knew what a rehearsed conclusion looked like. "Appreciated." The fire marshal left. An hour later, Caleb walked back to the barn with Gunnar. The debris was still warm, ash lifting in the breeze, the smell of burned metal and scorched wood heavy in the morning air. A crow sat on the twisted remains of the roof peak, watching them with one black eye. Gunnar, such. The dog moved through the debris field carefully, paws avoiding the hottest spots, nose working the ash in systematic sweeps. Near the southwest corner of the foundation, the point farthest from the electrical panel, Gunnar stopped, full alert, ears flat, body low, backing away from a section of scorched concrete where a dark stain had survived the heat. Caleb crouched and smelled the spot. Chemical, sharp, not electrical fire residue. Accelerant. The same organophosphate sharpness he had smelled in the fields and at the plant fence line. Someone had used the company's own product to start the fire. Their signature was their weapon. He photographed the stain, photographed Gunnar's alert posture beside it, photographed the distance from the stain to the electrical panel, which was 47 feet, far enough to make electrical fault a lie that could be measured in inches. Then his phone rang. The number was Walt Brennan's. Caleb answered. "Walt." "Caleb." The voice on the other end was different from the steady man in the machine shed. This voice shook. "I can't do it. I can't testify." "What happened?" "They came to see Dorothy yesterday at the hospital in Marion. 2 men in suits. They sat in her room. They didn't threaten her. They didn't have to. They sat in her hospital room, Caleb, while she was hooked up to an IV. They sat there and talked about how important AgriCorp is to the community. And then they left." "Walt, I can't. I'm sorry. I can't put her through that." The line went dead. Ash on his boots, ash on his hands, ash in the air where his barn had been, drifting slowly across the empty concrete pad like gray snow. Caleb sat on the foundation wall of the ruined building. The October sun was high and cold, casting sharp shadows across the debris field. Gunnar lay beside him in the ash, coat dusted gray,
chin on the ground, watching nothing. The market was closed. The permit was revoked. The barn was gone. Walt Brennan was gone. The county health inspector had signed his name to a fabricated violation. The fire marshal had ruled arson as accident. And somewhere in a federal office building, Caleb's former colleague had told him the system might respond in months. Months. The Gulf Coast case had taken 18 months. 3 men had died during the waiting. The system had responded eventually, the way glaciers respond to warmth, slowly, indifferently, long after the damage was done. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the leather notebook. The cover was soft from years of handling. The leather darkened where his thumb always rested. He opened it to the first page. Carl Jessup, Dwayne Poole, Richard Almonte. 3 names, 3 men who had trusted the system because a CGIS investigator told them the system could be trusted. 3 men who had waited while Caleb collected samples and filled out forms and built a case so airtight that a single miswritten date stamp brought it crashing down. The ash smell was in his nose, familiar now, a cousin to the smell that had followed him from the Gulf Coast to Iowa, from the coast to the center of the country, from the life he had left to the life he had tried to build. Chemical fire, deliberate destruction, the same playbook, different state, different field, same result. The Gulf Coast memory came without permission this time. Not the loading dock, not the courtroom. The funeral. Dwayne Poole's service, 18 months after the case collapsed. A Baptist church in Biloxi with a ceiling fan that wobbled slightly and a congregation that sang hymns Caleb did not know the words to. He had sat in the back pew in a borrowed suit with Gunner waiting in the truck outside, and he had listened to people describe a man he had known only as a witness. A man who coached Little League, who fixed neighbors' lawnmowers for free, who called his mother in Mobile every Sunday without fail. Poole's widow, Margaret, had found him in the parking lot afterward. She was small, dark-haired, wearing a black dress that did not quite fit because she had borrowed it from her sister. She had handed him a folded American flag. "Dwayne wanted you to have this," she said. "He said you tried." It was the flag from the dock workers' union ceremony, not a military flag, but she had folded it the way military families fold them, tight triangles, blue field showing. Caleb had held it in both hands and could not speak. The Mississippi heat pressed down on the parking lot. Margaret Poole walked back inside the church. Gunner barked once from the truck, a single sound that cut the afternoon in half. He closed the notebook. The names disappeared behind the leather cover. Gunner shifted beside him in the ash. The dog put his head on Caleb's boot, the weight of it solid and warm through the leather. 85 pounds of presence. The anchor he had carried from the Gulf to Iowa, from water to land, from the person he used to be to the person he had tried to become. Caleb looked down at the shepherd lying in the ash. Gray dust on his black coat, amber eyes open and steady. The dog did not look away. 3 names in this book, Caleb said aloud.
His voice sounded strange in the silence. Rough, tired, certain. I'm not adding a fourth. He closed the notebook and put it back in his pocket, looked toward town. The church steeple on Maple Street was visible above the trees, a thin white line against the October sky. The harvest blessing was in 5 days, same day as the festival. He thought about the sign on the marquee, "Come as you are." He had driven past it 3 times. Maybe it was time to stop driving. Caleb stood slowly. His knees ached from sitting on cold concrete. His shoulder throbbed where he had hit the frozen ground behind the drainage berm 2 nights ago. Ash covered his jeans, his boots, the palms of his hands. He brushed them together and watched the gray dust float away on the breeze, carrying the smell of everything he had lost. Gunnar rose beside him. The dog shook his coat once, sending a small cloud of ash into the October air, then looked up at Caleb and waited. Ready. Patient. The same look he had worn on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter, on the loading docks of Gulfport, on the seat of a pickup truck driving from the Gulf of Mexico to the center of a continent where the land was flat and the sky was wide, and a man could grow tomatoes and pretend the world was simple. All right. Caleb brushed ash from Gunnar's back. Let's go to work. The Harvest Festival was in 5 days. He had a phone full of evidence, a dog that could smell the truth, and a town full of people too afraid to stand. 5 days to change that. Caleb started with the houses he had not yet visited. Tuesday morning, 5 days before the festival. He drove with Gunnar in the passenger seat and the leather notebook in his jacket pocket, the pages warm from his body heat. He did not bring the soil data. He did not bring the phone evidence. He brought himself, his dog, and the truth, delivered the way a man delivers it when he has nothing left to trade but honesty. Jessie Callahan lived in a double-wide on the west edge of town. She was 31 years old, small-framed, with dark circles under her eyes, and a 2-year-old son named Marcus, who had red, scaly patches across both forearms that 3 doctors had diagnosed as eczema, and one had called idiopathic dermatitis, which, Jessie explained, was medical language for "we don't know." She stood on her porch holding Marcus on her hip, watching Caleb climb out of his truck. "You're the tomato man." "I am." "My neighbor said you've been going around asking about AgriCorp." "I have. She said not to talk to you, said it would cause trouble." "It might. But your son's rashes, have they gotten worse in the last 2 years?" Jessie's hand tightened on Marcus's hip. She looked at Caleb for a long moment, then at Gunnar, who had stepped down from the truck and was walking toward the porch steps. The shepherd stopped at the bottom step and looked up at the boy. Marcus reached out with one scaly hand. Gunnar held perfectly still while small fingers touched the fur between his ears. "Doggy," Marcus said. "That's Gunnar," Caleb said. Jessie watched her son touch the dog. Something in her face shifted. Not surrender. Decision. "Come inside." Caleb sat at Jessie's kitchen table and told her what was in the soil. The kitchen was small and clean, with children's drawings taped to the refrigerator and a plastic sippy cup drying upside down on the counter. She listened without interrupting, her hand resting on Marcus's back as the boy sat on the floor beside Gunnar, patting the dog's side with careful, deliberate strokes. His red-scaled forearms moved across Gunnar's black coat, and the dog remained perfectly still, accepting the touch with the patient gravity of an animal who understood that gentleness was sometimes the most important work. When Caleb finished, Jessie was quiet for a moment. She watched Marcus and the dog on the floor. Then she looked up, and her eyes were bright and hard. "The creek behind the playground. Marcus plays there every afternoon while I'm at work. My mother takes him. She lets him wade in it on hot days. He comes home with his feet muddy, and I wash them off, and I never once thought—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "You couldn't have known." "No, but I know now." She stood from the table. "What do you need me to do?" "Come to the Harvest Festival. Public forum, Saturday. Be willing to stand." "I'll stand. And if anyone tries to shut you down, I'll stand louder." The Fishers were next. Otto and Margaret Fisher, both in their 70s, married 51 years, working a small beef operation north of town on land that had been in Margaret's family since statehood. Their well water had tasted metallic for a year. Otto had mentioned it to the county health office. Gerald Fry had told him it was mineral deposits. Otto answered the door in overalls and a flannel shirt, a man who looked like he had been built from the same materials as his barn: wooden, angular, durable. "Mercer, heard you've been making noise." "Not as much as I'd like." "Come in. Margaret's making coffee." Their kitchen smelled like percolated coffee and wood polish. Margaret set 3 cups on the table without being asked and sat down beside her husband. A framed photograph on the wall showed the two of them standing in front of the same house, decades younger, a Holstein calf between them. Gunnar lay on the kitchen floor between the 2 chairs, chin on the linoleum, eyes moving between the old couple and Caleb. Caleb told them the soil results, the manufacturing facility, the financial coercion, the phone evidence. He kept it measured, factual, the same as with Walt. Otto listened with his hands folded on the table. Margaret listened with one hand on Otto's forearm, her thumb moving slowly back and forth across the flannel of his sleeve. When Caleb finished, Otto looked at his wife. "The well." "Yes," Margaret said. She looked at Caleb. "I've been tasting it for a year. Metallic, sharp. I told Otto it was mineral deposits." She paused. "That's what the county told us. Gerald Fry himself." "Gerald Fry never tested our water," Otto said. "He drove out here, looked at the wellhead, said it was minerals, and left. Took him about 4 minutes." "Did he take a sample?" "Didn't even bring a jar." Margaret looked at the photograph on the wall. "My grandmother built this house. My mother was born in the bedroom upstairs. I was born in the same room. We've been drinking from that well for 3 generations." She turned back to Caleb. Her eyes were bright. "It wasn't nothing. Will you come to the festival?" Otto and Margaret looked at each other. The kind of look that requires 51 years to develop. An entire conversation conducted in 3 seconds of eye contact. "We'll be there." Linda Wynne was the one Caleb had not expected. He found her at the diner during the afternoon lull, wiping tables while the cook scraped the grill in the kitchen. The smell of old coffee and floor cleaner hung in the air. "Linda, sit down. You look terrible. I need to tell you something about the school, about the playground." Linda stopped wiping. She set the cloth on the table and sat down across from him. Caleb told her about the Fisher acreage, the drainage creek, the runoff path to the community park. He told her about the soil data. He did not mention the phone. Linda was quiet for a long time. Her hands lay flat on the table, the same way they had when she stood at the counter after the Paulson door closed. The posture of a woman processing something she cannot undo. "The creek runs right along the east side of the park." "Yes." "The kids wade in it on field days. Emily's class made a science project out of collecting water samples last spring." She stopped. "Water samples? From the creek? Those children had their hands in that water." "Linda, 23 years I've worked this counter. I've watched every kid in this town grow up." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white against the tabletop. "If what you're saying is true, those children have been playing in poison while I poured coffee and told their parents everything was fine." "You didn't know." "No, but I know now." She looked at him with the same expression Jessie had worn. Decision. "Saturday, the festival. I'll bring Emily." 3 families. Not enough to fill a room. Enough to fill the front row. Caleb drove home in the late afternoon, with Gunnar riding shotgun. The fields on both sides of the road were harvested bare, stubble gold in the October light, the sky enormous and empty above them. He thought about the people who had opened their doors and the people who had closed them. He thought about Jesse Callahan's son, patting Gunnar's side with hands covered in rashes. About Margaret Fisher saying, "It wasn't nothin'." About Linda Wynne, who waitressed 6 days a week and had a daughter who took children outside every day because she believed fresh air was good for them. He called Ruth from the truck. 3 families confirmed, plus you and me. Margaret Hale's office confirmed her attendance at the panel. I got us 15 minutes at the public forum. 15 minutes. That's what they gave us. Is it enough? Caleb looked at Gunnar. The dog looked back at him, ears forward, steady. It's enough. Saturday, October 12th. The Harvest Festival at the Briar Station County Fairgrounds. The morning smelled like kettle corn and livestock, and the sharp sweetness of apple cider from the press near the main pavilion. The fairgrounds occupied 12 acres on the south edge of town, open-sided exhibition buildings, a small rodeo arena, rows of vendor tents selling crafts and canned goods and fried things on sticks. Tractors from 3 counties lined the north field for the annual equipment display. Children ran between the tents, dogs on leashes, music from a bluegrass trio near the stage. Agricorp had a corporate booth at the center of the vendor row. Green and white signage, branded merchandise, seed samples in glossy packets. Elena Voss stood behind the table in a navy blazer, greeting people with the warm competence of a woman who had spent her career turning uncomfortable situations into manageable ones. She smiled. She shook hands. She looked like she belonged. Caleb arrived at 10 o'clock. Gunnar walked beside him, leashed, coat brushed clean of the ash that had dusted it for 2 weeks, posture alert. Ruth Calder met them at the entrance gate, carrying a folder of documents and a thermos of tea. Behind them, at separate intervals so it would not look coordinated, Jessie Callahan arrived with Marcus on her hip. The Fishers in their Sunday clothes. Linda Wynne with her daughter Emily, who looked pale and determined and very young. Ready? Getting there. Caleb walked the fairgrounds before the forum. Old habit. Assess the space, note the exits, understand the sightlines. The main pavilion was a steel-sided building with folding chairs arranged in rows of 12, a podium at the front, and a portable projector screen behind it. The acoustics were poor. Metal walls, concrete floor, sound bouncing in every direction. A man speaking from that podium would need to project his voice and hold attention against every ambient noise from the festival outside. The agricultural policy panel sat at a table near the front. 3 officials and 2 invited speakers. Margaret Hale, Assistant Attorney General, Agricultural Fraud Division, occupied the 3rd seat from the left. She was in her 50s, compact, with short gray hair and the attentive stillness of a person who spent more time listening than talking. She wore no jewelry. Her briefcase was closed. She looked like a woman who had attended 100 of these panels and expected nothing from the 101st. Caleb intended to change that. He found his seat in the front row. Ruth sat beside him. Gunnar lay between their chairs, his body positioned toward the door, tracking every person who entered. Jessie and Marcus sat 3 seats to the right, the Fishers behind them. Linda and Emily at the end of the row. 5 families and a dog, arranged across the front of a metal building in a county fairground, waiting for 15 minutes at a podium to change the direction of a town. At 11:15, Caleb walked to the pavilion entrance to check the projector connection. Elena Voss was already there, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. She had seen him coming. "Chief," Elena, 15 minutes at a county fair. That's your plan? It's a start. Elena studied him. Her expression was difficult to read. Not contempt, not fear, something between resignation and respect. You don't want to do this. This town needs AgriCorp. This town needs the truth. The truth. She almost smiled. That's a luxury for people who don't have mortgages. She walked past him into the pavilion. Caleb watched her take a seat in the 2nd row, directly behind the panel table, front and center. She was not hiding. Ruth touched Caleb's arm. It's time. The pavilion was 3/4 full. Farmers in work jackets and feed caps, families with children, town council members in the 3rd row, a reporter from the county newspaper, young, with a notebook and a digital recorder balanced on her knee. Elena Voss in the 2nd row, legs crossed, briefcase beside her chair. Walt Brennan. Caleb's eyes found him immediately. In the back row, near the exit door, feed cap pulled low, hands in his pockets. The old man's face was unreadable. He could have been waiting for a bus. Caleb walked to the podium. Gunnar walked beside him and sat at his left, facing the crowd. Professional posture. Working dog stance. Back straight, ears forward. Eyes scanning the room, the way he had once scanned dock faces and cargo holds during Coast Guard boarding operations. The dog looked like he belonged at a podium, which was more than most people who stood behind one could say. The microphone hummed.
Caleb adjusted it down. He was tall enough that most podiums were set too high. My name is Caleb Mercer. I'm a retired senior chief petty officer from the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service. I spent 22 years conducting federal investigations, including environmental crime cases along the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean. For the last 2 years, I've been growing tomatoes in Briar Station. I'm here because something is wrong with the soil in this county, and I have evidence that the source is the Harlan AgriCorp facility on Industrial Road. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. A murmur moved through the middle rows like wind through standing corn. Elena Voss did not move. Caleb showed the soil results first. 3 farms, the compound, the concentrations, 4 times the federal safety threshold. The projector threw the numbers onto the screen in blue and white, clinical and precise. He explained what chlorpyrifos was, what it did to soil, to water, to the human body. He kept it factual, no emotion, no adjectives. The numbers spoke for themselves. Then he showed the dead circles, photographs from the Henderson field, the perfect geometric rings of dead vegetation around each sprinkler head, precise as compass arcs. The room murmured louder. A farmer in the 4th row leaned forward in his chair. Margaret Hale's pen stopped moving. She looked at the screen over the top of her reading glasses. These results are laboratory verified by the Iowa Department of Agriculture. The compound identified is chlorpyrifos, a restricted use organophosphate banned for residential application. It was found in the soil of 3 farms that use AgriCorp's distributed nutrient product. Elena shifted in her seat. Margaret Hale was writing. But I understand that numbers on a screen can be disputed. Laboratories can be questioned. Test results can be challenged by attorneys who are paid by the hour to make evidence disappear. So I brought something that can't be disputed. Caleb looked at Ruth. She stood and placed 3 metal bowls on the table beside the podium. Each bowl was labeled with a strip of masking tape. Bowl 1, Mercer Farm, untreated. Bowl 2, AgriCorp distributed product, treated field. Bowl 3, Henderson Field, dead circle. The room went quiet. This dog served 4 years in the United States Coast Guard as a chemical and narcotics detection canine. He has never been wrong. Caleb unclipped the leash. Gunner, such. The shepherd rose and approached the table. His nose moved to bowl 1. He sniffed it calmly, tail relaxed, posture neutral. Clean soil, no reaction. He moved on. Bowl 2. He paused. His ears shifted forward. His nostrils worked in faster rhythm. He sniffed again, circled the bowl once, then moved on with a slight tension in his shoulders. Treated soil. Something present, but below threshold. Bowl 3. Gunner's body changed. Ears flat forward, shoulders dropped, hindquarters shifted backward. He backed away from the bowl, nose still locked on it. The same chemical detection posture Caleb had seen at the Saturday market, at the Henderson field, at the AgriCorp fence line at midnight. Full alert. The dog would not go near the bowl. He stared at it and growled once, low and short, a sound that carried through the silent pavilion and settled on the shoulders of every person in the room. The room was absolutely quiet. 200 people watching a German shepherd refuse to approach a bowl of dirt. A woman in the 5th row put her hand over her mouth. The farmer who leaned forward earlier was now gripping the chair in front of him with both hands. In the 2nd row, Elena Voss sat perfectly still, her briefcase untouched beside her chair, her face carrying the expression of someone watching an outcome she had hoped would not arrive. That's the soil from the dead circle at Henderson's Field, the same soil Tomas Reyes was standing in when he collapsed. Caleb looked at the crowd. This dog doesn't read lab reports. He doesn't have an opinion about corporate agriculture. He smells what's there, and what's there is a banned chemical compound at 4 times the federal safety threshold, manufactured half a mile from where your children go to school. Margaret Hale had stopped writing. She was leaning forward, both hands flat on the table, her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. There's one more thing. Caleb pulled the sealed evidence bag from his jacket. The room watched him handle it, carefully, by the edges, the way a man handles evidence when he has spent 22 years learning that one careless touch can destroy a case. This phone was hidden at the Route 14 grain elevator by Tomas Reyes, a seasonal farm worker who spent 2 months documenting nighttime operations at the AgriCorp facility. He hid it in a wall cavity because he had nowhere safe to store it. He did this alone, without authority, without protection, because he saw something wrong and decided someone needed to know. He set the bag on the podium and played the first video on the projector. The screen filled with grainy footage. A loading dock, trucks, white drums without labels being loaded at 3 in the morning. The timestamp glowed in the corner, 3:12 a.m., August 23rd. 2 men in coveralls carrying drums that bore no hazmat placards, no product markings, nothing but white plastic and industrial handles. The farmer in the 4th row stood up, then sat down, then stood up again, because sitting did not feel adequate for what he was seeing. That's the plant. That's the loading dock. I deliver grain there. Those drums, I've seen them stacked inside the building. The room erupted. Elena Voss stood. The noise in the pavilion died as she walked forward, not to the podium. She stopped in the aisle between the rows, facing both Caleb and the crowd. Her face was composed, but her hands were still, folded in front of her body, and Caleb recognized the posture. It was the stance of someone who had run out of strategies and was now standing on the only ground left. Conviction. This man is a retired federal agent with a personal grudge against corporate agriculture. He brings a dog trick and an unverified phone that could have been planted by anyone. She looked at the crowd. Harlan AgriCorp has employed over 200 people in this county for 5 years. We've invested $11 million in local infrastructure. I grew up in this town. I know every person in this room. Caleb did not argue credentials. He did not defend the evidence. He stepped aside from the podium and said quietly, "Ask the farmers." The back row. A chair scraped against the concrete floor. Walt Brennan stood. He was 73 years old and had spoken at public meetings approximately never. His feed cap was in his hands, crushed between thick fingers. His voice, when it came, was rough and unsteady. My wife's been sick 2 years. Dorothy. Most of you know her. He paused. She's in Marion General right now. I've been afraid to say this because I thought they'd take the farm. But I'm more afraid of what happens if I don't say it. Our well draws from the same aquifer that runs under the fields where we've been spreading AgriCorp product. Nobody tested the water. Nobody asked. He looked at Elena. You sent people to sit in my wife's hospital room. Elena's expression did not change, but her hands unfolded and dropped to her sides. Jesse Callahan stood. Marcus was on her hip, his red-patched forearms visible above the collar of his jacket. My son has rashes that 3 doctors can't explain. We live 400 yards from a treated field. Otto Fisher stood, pulling Margaret up beside him. Our well water has tasted like metal for a year. The county told us it was mineral deposits. Linda Wynne stood. Her daughter Emily stood beside her, a young woman in her 20s, with the startled expression of someone learning that the ground her students played on was not what she thought it was. My daughter teaches 2nd grade at Briar Station Elementary. The playground borders the Fisher Drainage Creek. Others. A man Caleb had not visited, who farmed soybeans east of town. He stood slowly, cap in hand, and said nothing, just stood, which was enough. A woman who ran the daycare on Maple Street stood and said her 3-year-olds played in the yard all summer. The hardware store owner, Dale Hammond, who had first told Caleb about Tomas Reyes collapsing, stood and looked at Elena with an expression that contained decades of small-town trust dissolving in a single afternoon. One by one, standing from their chairs, not organized, not rehearsed, just people who had been carrying questions they were afraid to ask, until someone asked first. The county newspaper reporter was writing fast, her pen moving across the notebook in urgent shorthand. The digital recorder on her lap blinked red. Elena Voss remained standing in the aisle. The room was full of people on their feet, and she was the only one not joining them. Her arms hung at her sides. The blazer she had worn like armor all morning looked different now. The posture inside it diminished. And Caleb recognized something he had seen before in people who reached the end of their performance. Not the end of their conviction, which was different. The end of the version of themselves they had built for public consumption. She looked at Caleb. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The pavilion was full of noise, chairs moving, voices murmuring, children asking their parents what was happening. But between Caleb and Elena, the air was still. Then she said quietly, not to the crowd, but to him, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who has stopped performing. When I came back to Briar Station, this town had a 30% poverty rate and 3 empty storefronts on Main Street. I brought those numbers down. I know the cost was too high. But someone had to do something. The room was silent. Someone did, Caleb said. Just not the right thing. Margaret Hale stood from the panel table. She had her phone in one hand and a card in the other. The attentive stillness she had carried all morning had shifted into something more active. She looked like a woman who had not expected anything from the 101st panel and had found something worth the drive. Mr. Mercer, I'm requesting that you provide my office with the original evidence and the chain of custody documentation immediately. I'm also requesting an emergency inspection of the AgriCorp facility on Industrial Road, effective today.
She looked at Elena. Ms. Voss, I'd advise you to contact your legal department.
Elena nodded once. She did not argue. She did not make a statement. She walked out of the pavilion without speaking to anyone, her heels clicking on the concrete floor, and the door closed behind her with a sound that was quieter than the room expected. Near the podium, a child from the crowd had wandered toward Gunnar. A girl, maybe 6 years old, holding a half-eaten corn dog. She held it out toward the shepherd with the grave generosity that children reserve for animals they have decided to love. Gunnar looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded. The dog took the corn dog gently from the girl's hand, tail sweeping once, and the girl giggled. The room laughed. Not loud, not long. The sound of people exhaling after holding their breath for a very long time. By sunset, 3 state vehicles were parked outside the Agricorp processing facility on Industrial Road. The gates were open. Men and women in EPA windbreakers and state police uniforms moved between the building and their trucks, carrying sealed containers and documentation boxes. Yellow tape marked the perimeter. A generator hummed somewhere inside, powering the lights that the inspectors would need through the night. The nutrient processing facility sign looked different now. The same green and white, the same corporate font. But the words meant something else when read beneath yellow tape in the light of a state police cruiser. Elena Voss sat in her car in the parking lot across the road. Engine running, going nowhere. Her silhouette was visible through the windshield, unmoving, a dark shape in a silver car, watching the building where her career had ended, and her convictions had not been enough. Caleb drove past on his way home. He did not stop. He did not look at her car for more than a moment. Some reckonings were not his to witness. Gunnar rode shotgun. His window was cracked 2 inches, and his nose sampled the evening air as they passed the facility. He did not alert. The wind was blowing east, carrying the chemical smell away from the road and toward the open fields, where it would eventually thin and dissolve and become part of the enormous Iowa sky. 3 weeks later. The morning of November 2nd smelled like frost and fresh paint. Caleb stood at his produce stand at the Briar Station Farmers Market, arranging the last of the season's tomatoes, Cherokee purples, stubbornly holding their color despite the dropping temperatures, beside jars of pickled peppers he had put up during the weeks the stand was closed. A new sign hung from the front of the table, hand-painted on cedar planking. Mercer Farm, Briar Station grown. His market permit had been restored 9 days after the festival. Gerald Fry, the county health inspector, had retired unexpectedly. No one in town seemed particularly surprised. Gunnar did his morning circuit. 2 laps, clockwise, then counter. The October urgency had left his patrol. He moved at an easier pace now, stopping to accept a scratch behind the ears from Gladys, the retired schoolteacher, investigating a spilled bag of kettle corn near the honey stand, sniffing the autumn air at each corner of the lot before returning to his position beneath the table. He circled once and lay down, chin on paws. All clear? His ears twitched. Acceptable. The first customer of the morning was Walt Brennan. He walked slowly to the stand, work boots heavy on the gravel, and studied the tomatoes for a moment before picking up 2.
Dorothy started a new treatment last week. Doctor in Iowa City. Not better yet. But she's fighting.
She's tough.
She is.
Walt set a $5 bill on the table. The tomatoes cost 3. He did not wait for change. Ruth stopped by an hour later, carrying a paper bag from the bakery, and the particular expression of a woman who had information to deliver. She set the bag on the table and pulled out 2 cinnamon rolls the size of softballs, then poured herself tea from the thermos she kept in her car because she did not trust anyone else's. Plants shuttered, permanently. State revoked the operating permit on Thursday. EPA Region 7 opened a formal investigation. The Kansas facility is being re-inspected. She broke a piece off one of the rolls. Harlan AgriCorp issued a statement calling it a voluntary compliance action, which is corporate language for "we got caught." What about Elena? Reassigned to corporate headquarters in Indianapolis. Not arrested, not charged, Ruth shrugged. She's a regional director. The manufacturing decisions came from above her. The system moves slowly, but it moves. And Tomas? Recovering, staying in Briar Station. Working for Walt now, as of last week. Full-time, she smiled. Apparently, Walt told him, "You had more guts with a $30 phone than I had with 400 acres. Least I can do is give you a job." And the other farms? State's offering free soil testing to every property in the county. Jesse Callahan's pediatrician is running new blood work on Marcus. The Fisher's well is being tested next week. She paused. Linda's daughter Emily moved recess indoors until the playground soil is cleared. The kids aren't happy about it, but they'll survive. Caleb arranged the pickled pepper jars in a straight line and said nothing. Some things did not require commentary. Ruth ate her cinnamon roll and watched the market fill with Saturday morning people, and Gunnar lay beneath the table, accepting occasional pats from customers who had learned that the big shepherd at the tomato stand would tolerate almost anything except unearned praise. Sunday, November 3rd. The First Lutheran Church on Maple Street held its harvest blessing at 10 o'clock in the morning. The sanctuary smelled like chrysanthemums and wood polish, and the coffee brewing in the fellowship hall downstairs. Sunlight fell through tall windows onto the backs of 60 or 70 people seated in oak pews. Caleb stood in the back row. He had come in after the service started, slipping through the door during the opening hymn, finding a spot near the wall where he could stand without being noticed. He wore a clean flannel shirt and the canvas jacket with no insignia. His hands held the hymnal open to a page he did not sing from. Outside the door, Gunnar waited on the front steps of the church. Caleb could see his shadow through the frosted glass panel, a large dark shape lying across the threshold, patient, undisturbed by the singing voices inside. The pastor, a woman in her 60s with a voice made for rooms this size, spoke about harvest, about what the land gives and what it takes, about the responsibility of stewardship, which she defined as caring for things you did not create and cannot control. She did not mention AgriCorp. She did not mention soil tests or festivals or the facility on Industrial Road. She spoke about gratitude for rain and for people who tend the earth honestly. Caleb listened. He did not bow his head during the prayer. He did not close his eyes. He stood in the back row with the hymnal in his hands and looked at the sunlight on the floor and thought about a church in Biloxi where a ceiling fan wobbled and a widow handed him a flag he did not deserve. When the service ended, he walked out the side door before the congregation began to move. Gunnar was waiting on the steps, lying in a patch of November sun with his chin on crossed paws. His tail swept once when Caleb appeared. "Let's go." They walked to the truck parked on the street. The morning was cold and bright. Frost on the windshields of parked cars. The church bell rang once behind them, a single note that hung in the clean air and faded slowly, the way church bells do in small towns, where there is nothing between the steeple and the horizon to interrupt the sound. Caleb opened the passenger door, and Gunnar jumped in. Before climbing in himself, Caleb stood for a moment with his hand on the truck's roof and looked down Maple Street toward the edge of town. The fields were visible from here, brown and quiet and enormous, stretching to a horizon that looked like a ruler line drawn across the bottom of the sky. Somewhere out there, beneath the soil, the chemicals were still present. They would be present for years. You could not undo what had been done to the ground. You could only stop doing it and wait for the earth to heal at its own pace, in its own time, in its own silence. He climbed in the truck and drove home. Monday morning. The market stand was set up by 7:30. Tomatoes, peppers, pickled goods, the cedar sign with its hand-painted letters. Caleb straightened a jar, adjusted the cash box, and poured coffee from the thermos he had brought from the farmhouse. The coffee was strong and black, and the steam rose from the cup in the cold air and disappeared. Gunnar completed his double circuit and returned. He circled once beneath the table, nosed the cooler, an optimistic assessment that there might be bacon, then lay down in the patch of shade on the east side of the stand where the morning sun had not yet reached. He rested his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. The fields beyond the parking lot stretched flat to every horizon, gold stubble under a pale November sky, the corn gone, the wheat gone, the earth resting beneath the weight of winter coming. Somewhere south of town, state contractors were drilling test wells on the Henderson property, measuring what the soil had absorbed and what could be cleaned. It would take years. Soil remembers what is done to it long after the people responsible have moved on to other offices in other states. But soil also heals. Given time and clean water and the absence of poison, the microorganisms return, the roots take hold, and the land produces again. That was the thing about dirt. It wanted to grow things. You just had to stop killing it first. A car pulled into the lot. Caleb did not recognize it. A woman in a green jacket stepped out, studied the vendor row, and walked toward his stand. "Are these Cherokee purples?" "Last of the season." "I'll take 4. He bagged the tomatoes. She paid. She left. Ordinary. Simple. The kind of transaction that happens 10,000 times a day in 10,000 small towns across the country, and means nothing except that a person grew something and another person thought it was worth buying. Gunnar opened one eye when the car door shut. He studied the departing vehicle for a moment, with the professional assessment of a dog who had spent his career evaluating whether things required his attention. The car was unremarkable. The driver was unremarkable. The morning was unremarkable. He decided the visitor was acceptable and closed his eye again. Caleb leaned against the table and drank his coffee. The market was filling. Cars pulling in, doors opening and closing. The honey seller setting out new jars. The hat-knitting woman arranging her woodland animals in a row. Gladys, the retired schoolteacher, walking toward the stand with her usual purposeful stride. The Saturday morning sounds of a small town doing what small towns do: buying, selling, greeting, complaining about the weather, asking after each other's families, carrying on. He thought about the leather notebook in his jacket pocket. 3 names. He had not added a 4th. He had not fixed what had happened to Carl Jessup, or Dwayne Poole, or Richard Almonte. He could not reach backward through time and rewrite a date stamp on a form, or speed up a judge's ruling, or keep a shipping company's lawyers from finding the crack in a case that had cost 3 men their lives. Those names would stay in the notebook. The guilt would stay with them. That was the cost of the work, and no amount of clean soil in Iowa would settle that account. But Tomas Reyes was alive. Dorothy Brennan was fighting. Marcus Callahan's rashes would be diagnosed properly now. The playground at Briar Station Elementary would be tested, and the facility at the end of Industrial Road would never produce another drum of poison. That was what he could do. That was what he had done. Not because the system worked. It had failed him once and moved too slowly twice. But because a dog had smelled something wrong in a grain truck on a Saturday morning, and the man holding the leash had been trained to listen. The fields stretched flat to every horizon, gold stubble under a pale November sky, the wind carrying the clean smell of turned earth across the parking lot, and through the market where a man sold tomatoes and a dog slept in the shade, and the morning moved on without requiring anything more. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing so you can join us for the next one. And leave a comment telling us where you're listening from today. Every place in this world deserves more stories about courage, loyalty, and the people who refuse to look away. God bless you, your family, and the animals in your life. May He bring peace to your home and remind you that even when the ground beneath you has been poisoned, the harvest can still be clean.